Good morning. This is the final lecture of Science of the Physical Universe 17. I hope you'll have left off your papers at the top. They're paper copies of the exam study questions, and they'll be on the website. Are there any other technical issues that we need to announce? There will also be 2 review sessions that will be announced. One next week, one the week after. And so today, we're incredibly lucky. I'm incredibly happy to have 2 of the most amazing musicians working today here in class. Anne-Marie Calhoun is the leading rock violinist in the world. And in my view, Ringo Starr and Jethro Tull and Mick Jagger have been lucky enough to play with her. She's absolutely terrific and has happily for us come to class, and we'll be alternating between string theory, Einstein's view of God, and a review of this course with interventions by her, and Mike Einziger, who is a writer and lead guitarist for Incubus, as you know, a 16 platinum winning band of one of the great bands of our epoch. And Mike is a former student in SPU 17, so he knows all about things here. And we'll have a chance to have some exchanges back and forth. They'll ask me some questions, I'll ask them some questions, and you may have questions for them too. We'll proceed in 3 parts. First, a review of the course, the main things that I think come out of where you are now in your knowledge of Einstein and the 20th and 21st centuries. We'll then turn to Einstein's legacy in nuclear weapons and string theory, the holographic principle, one of the great debates of the contemporary moment in fundamental physics. And then finally, we'll turn to Einstein's vision of God and then wrap it all up, having mastered all this and more. So please also welcome our guests, Mike Einziger and Anne-Marie Calhoun. So I want to begin by asking, what did Einstein want? What is he after? And that's going to be the recurrent question that brings together everything in today's lecture. But I want to start with the question of space-time and machines. As you know, or it can be summarized in this little trio of images, Einstein looked at the photoelectric effect, at Brownian motion, at relativity that eventually culminated in 1915 in general relativity, 3 avenues that opened up the whole of 20th century physics. The photoelectric effect and the associated work on quantum begins quantum theory in its modern sense in a very real way. It's the work for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1921, although obviously if the Nobel Prize Committee had really tried to recognize Einstein, they would have been giving him Nobel Prizes every year for year after year. But the Brownian motion established through the random fluctuations and motions in a liquid how that atoms and molecules were real, not just an artifact hypothesized to save the phenomena, as the expression went, to replicate experimental results, but really now even the doubters came to believe that atoms and molecules needed to be taken seriously. And then, of course, relativity theory, which brought together space and time as they had never been brought together before, and offered a radical new position for the human in the universe by redefining, in a sense, what physical laws were supposed to do, that they really should be independent of frame of reference, and that there was a perspectival independence that was fundamental to any future law of physics. So it was more than a law of physics, it was a meta-law. It was a law governing laws and set the framework under which all future physical laws would be understood. All of this was 1905, and then as an encore, Einstein produced E equals mc squared, which we've discussed in some detail and which will recur as a theme throughout what I have to say today. So at a first level, Einstein's contributions were about unifying continuity and granularity, space and time. And these forms of unity, these variations on unity, is where I want to turn first, in particular attending to the physical and philosophical technological world in which Einstein found himself. The techno-material world of the late 19th century was one to which Einstein had a ringside seat by accident. He had wanted, of course, to become a professor. He couldn't even get a job in a secondary school. He was rejected by many of his teachers, but he ended up, through connections, family connections and others, getting a job at the patent office in Bern. And there he saw all of the great technologies of the time at the cutting edge, sorting back and forth between those that represented novel contributions to our knowledge of the technical world from those that were redundant and already accepted inventions. And what Einstein did characteristically was to figure out what the fundamental issue, what the principles were behind each of these apparatus. So, for example, one of the great technological obvious features of the world were colloids, that is to say, suspended particles. So when London and Berlin and New York and Chicago were covered with smoke, in the 19th century that was seen as a form of progress. And when you go to the art museums and you see 19th century paintings with great smokestacks, it's not for them an issue of pollution so much as an example of modernity. Well, Einstein's Brownian motion addressed the motion of those smoke particles. Smoke particles were very much part of the physical technical world around him. Electrical generators were perhaps the greatest symbol of modernity. These huge machines were beginning to power up the cities Moscow, New York, Chicago, Berlin, London, and suddenly street lights and private lamps became a crucial part of the physical world. The filament in such a lamp is a perfect example of black body radiation. That is to say, something that radiates but doesn't reflect much light. It's called black body because nothing reflected is contributing to the light that's streaming out from it. Understanding what frequency a body like a filament had, what kind of light it emitted at a given temperature, was one of the great fundamental physics questions of the time. One of the mysteries was, why did it seem to be universal? And we talked about that in the course. Why was it the same if one heats up a BlackBerry or a brick? They both, to the same temperature, they would both give off the same set of frequencies. And work on that led directly to reasoning about the quantum nature of the world. That's what Planck was worried about. That was what Einstein was worried about. It was one of the great physical problems. So these questions, generators, filaments, smokestacks, these generated issues that were very much on the table of modernity, so to speak. Another issue was that of mapping the world. Suddenly, as you begin to lay cables, Poincaré, one of the great mathematicians, philosophers, and literary figures of the 19th century, was also in charge of the Bureau of Longitude. And he began to direct this army, literally, on people enrolled in the armed forces of France, to circulate all around the world and send back signals by telegraph coordinating clocks. Because, as we've discussed, coordinating clocks was the same thing as determining longitude. And so the question of simultaneity, of two clocks coordinated on distant places, Brazil and Paris, Washington, and the distant reaches of the Earth, was all part of the United States, France, and Britain competing to centralize and organize a map of the world. And as Poincaré began to consider these quite technical questions, he also began to realize that they generated a philosophical one by saying, what is simultaneity? And working on this set of problems, Poincaré began to see that time and simultaneity were all at once a question of philosophy, and he began to publish in philosophy journals about the nature of time, saying that simultaneity was just the exchange of signals corrected for how long it took to get from A to B. The technology of time synchronization was a problem for determining longitude and mapping the world. And then in December of 1900, he understood that this was a radical way of reformulating electrodynamics of moving bodies, which Einstein took up too, Einstein was also embedded, as we know, in this world of time coordination, not because he was trying to map the world, that was not a big problem for Switzerland, but making clocks and making them accurately was. So as they began to launch their train system and coordinate the stations on it and coordinate their stations with the great metropoles of Berlin and Paris, simultaneity became an issue that was handled at train stations like this one on the left, opposite Einstein's patent office, one of the first places to put coordinated clocks, or Poincaré using the Eiffel Tower as a massive antenna to transmit time signals to boats at sea. Right away, Einstein was recognized by many of his contemporaries, including the assassin Adler, who we discussed at great length, that Einstein was doing something different, as symbolized in this chart by showing that everyone else had two different times, whether you were at rest with respect to the ether or you were moving with respect to the ether, and Adler wrote down just dots because Einstein did not recognize any ether. He thought there was no privileged reference frame. And so for Einstein, time had no absolute value. There was only times, not time. Adler, however sympathetic he was to Einstein's effort to coordinate clocks, couldn't stand Einstein's idea in general relativity and special relativity that there was what Einstein called a peculiar circumstance, namely that if you traveled around and came back, you would have less time elapsed on your clock than a twin that stayed at home. And Adler thought this represented an insurmountable logical contradiction. And Einstein was fought by some of his friends, by many of his enemies, about this reconceptualization of time. Einstein replied with his play within a play, his dialogue about objections to the theory of relativity, in which he took his opponents, reduced them to an exchange between a relativist and someone he called criticus. And criticus stood in for various of his enemies, but when he said, "I am more convicted than convinced," Einstein surely had Adler in mind, who was then serving a death sentence for the assassination of Prime Minister Sturg. So back to Einstein's thought style. So in this world of modern technology, Einstein had developed a particular way of thinking. He was on the one side a relativist and a positivist. That is to say, he wanted no absolute simultaneity, no absolute time, and to rely on observations above any theorizing that postulated metaphysical entities. On the other hand, he was looking for absolutes of a new kind, and he was able to find them, for instance, in the space-time distance that was the same for every frame of reference, even if ordinary space difference and time difference differed from frame to frame. All of his papers had the characteristic, as we've discussed, of starting with principles, emerging through thought experiments, making measurable predictions, and using heuristics when he needed to say, here's what we know, but we can't go farther given our current understanding. And that's how he treated, for instance, the idea that light came in quantum bundles. He didn't know how to reconcile that with the wave theory, but he knew that there was an aspect of light that was particulate. That ability to tolerate seeming contradiction marked him out as these other methods and forms of thought did, as having a distinctive way of approaching the world that was both realist in his ambition, but able to tolerate heuristic arguments when he needed to. The world that Einstein emerged in artistically was also sympathetic to the getting rid of that which was metaphysical, perhaps most famously on the design art side, the Bauhaus in Dessau, where they tried to strip down function and form so that they would match. This building, which may look familiar in its modernity, was so alien it had myriad enemies, including the Nazi regime, who shut them down and persecuted their practitioners. But this form of modernity, this idea of a world stripped down, is one that was sympathetic not only for Einstein, but for many of the people in the Vienna Circle, this first group of logical positivists who adopted many of the Bauhaus ideas in their own work. Otto Neurath, for instance, liked very much lamps like those on the left, which were stripped down to their geometrical essences, and he detested as metaphysical mumbo-jumbo, the leftover of a bygone age, attempts to make electric lights that looked like gas lights that were imitating oil lights. Einstein wanted a world that was complete, external, and intelligible, not dependent on us. A world that we could aspire to understand fully, grasp with differential equations that captured the causal relationships of the world, and make predictions. In his general relativity, for instance, he predicted how the apparent position of a star would be bent as the light traversed a curved space-time, making it look like it was on the red line when it was in fact on the yellow line and being bent, so it looked like it came from a place where it wasn't. And that the observational confirmation of that by Eddington, which was partly a political gesture, partly a scientific gesture, was one that created a form of unity, not unity of space and time so much as a unity of England and Germany and of scientists and experiment and theory across the devastation of World War I. The world of art crossed many times with Einstein's work, one way, for instance, through Kandinsky and the Blaue Reiter, as we've discussed, another through images like this, where film, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and the kinds of constructions and images of a future were represented in it, show up also in Mendelssohn, the architect Mendelssohn's sketch for the Einstein Tower, which was all at once a gesture towards the biological, almost morphological forms of biology, but also a streamlined submarine or air wing, which was also, in fact, shaped to be a laboratory to check Einstein's theory. So it was not only a tribute to Einstein, it was supposed to be a laboratory that would measure the redshift of the sun's light as it went down through the observatory, as you see in this cutaway sketch, and then was sent horizontally to form a prism. Einstein himself, his face, became an icon, for instance, in Hannah Höchst's famous collage, where you see him in the upper left, of that which was all things modern. Einstein was celebrated starting in 1919. He finds himself on the cover of Time, the first of many instances of that. His ideas about the curvature of space and time show up in Dali's paintings in various forms. I'll just mention here briefly a project that I'm working on with William Kentridge, a particularly interesting and artist who works in many different media today, in which we're preparing an exhibit for Documenta in June of 2012 that's organized into 3 acts. The first called The River of Absolute Time. The second is called A Peculiar Consequence, which is Einstein's name for the twin paradox. And the third is called The Society for the Destruction of Information. Kentridge is famous for images like this. That's a self-portrait in a... he did an opera at the Met last year called The Nose. And we've begun to assemble things like standards of weights and measures, or this one, the famous kilogram K in Paris, which it turns out is losing its weight. K has lost 50 millionths of a gram in the last 120 years, and so in 2.4 billion years, K will be completely gone at this rate and look like this, which is intolerable, and the Bureau of Measures has begun procedures to fire K as the world standard, the universal standard. So we've begun to think about, we're in a space that we've taken over in Kassel in Germany, an old hotel that was bombed out in World War II. Before that, it had been a huge theater. We're making a space for failed objects, and there'll be a museum of failed objects on one side, and then a main space which will have a series of images like this, which you'll recognize from this course, and various forms of dance and music around the measure of spaces. This is one of the actors who will be running time in various forms. And these are these telegraphic signaling devices that we're making for the show. And a film, we'll go into that later if you're interested. So that is part 1. where this course was headed, and I now would like to invite the musical side of this dialogue to begin.
Thank you for such a generous introduction. It's our honor.
A pleasure.
Hi guys. Yeah, so this is fun for me because I took this class last year, and or 2 years ago. I don't know. I took this class.
It's the space-time distortions.
Yeah. So we're gonna play a song right now that's kind of falls in line with this idea that like Einstein figured that energy could be converted, or mass could be converted into energy. And this song is called "We Are All Tomorrow's Food," and kind of it's just a play on that idea that we all return to this sort of perpetually running cycle of life. And Marie is going to join me. This is actually an Incubus song off. We have a new album that's coming out in July, so this will be an instrumental version of that song. And here it goes.
Yeah. So, Mike and Emery, I have a question, which is, do you think of, I mean, the piece has a lot of different flows, and I mean, one way you could think about this conversion is the sort of the time base of the song. Is that how you're picturing it? As I mean, it also has a kind of elegiac quality to it,
Yeah.
and I wonder how you're thinking about the flow over the course of the song as a conversion, or perhaps as a loss in some way.
Well, kind of the song is really sort of in two different parts, and it kind of goes from one phase of existence to another, and it's just sort of like a gradual conversion from one sound to a different sound. One sound being sort of more rooted in like a more identifiable sort of rhythmic scheme, and then the latter kind of morphs into something that's more like it definitely has a pulse to it, but it's a bit more like esoteric and could really just be a perpetual cycle that keeps repeating itself. I ended it so that we could keep talking and class could continue, but it could literally just keep repeating itself. But it's again, it's kind of the music is based on this idea of completing a cycle, and I guess I like that idea.
Yes.
The idea of completing
Yes.
cycles.
There's also a kind of a high tone that occurs throughout at least the last 2/3 of the piece that almost has a machine or clock-like, I mean, almost an electronic beat that's also against this very human scale sound that's in the background. I thought that was interesting.
Everybody's got a different clock in their own head, and this is something that we, I think you guys are musicians, Emery probably, can talk a little bit about that, but everybody's got a different clock in their head, and everybody perceives time differently. So the idea of time not being this absolute thing, that it is different for everybody. Like something, different nights that we're performing concerts or here as well. Like, if you're not playing to like a metronome or something that is sort of very constant, it's perceived. Like I could walk away from that experience really feeling like, wow, I played really quickly. I played much too fast, and then one of the other people that I play with will say, no, that was really slow. And everybody has like kind of a drastically different perspective on what time is.
How do you think of time in music, Emery?
I think music is unique because we create our own time. We create our own meters, and that's independent of a clock. Actually, no, if you do it to a metronome, you're basing it on a clock-like rhythm. But we create time independently, and the idea of mass creating time is something that I feel intuitively as a musician. If the music gets heavy and you have a retardando, that mass actually will slow down your time and will expand time in a moment that feels very natural and organic. I think time also has the ability to create space as well. When you're playing really quickly, I feel like you create a spacescape. You create a narrowness or an openness depending on how the music is flowing on your tempo.
It's really interesting. One of the things we talked about in the course were how poets responded to relativity. And, Carlos Williams, for instance, said that he found in the idea of relativistic time a kind of liberatory justification for what he wanted to do with free verse. And I think that there is a way in which art in the post-1900 period has wanted to be able to play with space and time in a freer way than was permitted by classical conceptions.
Well, I mean, like, and Einstein, I'm sure did you guys discuss in the class, like Einstein's relationship with music was very, very well defined, and just the idea though of time being this elastic thing is that's what really sort of struck me about it, and it really translates well to like somebody who's a musician who kind of messes around with the idea of time all the time. So
Like Dali's Camembert.
Yeah, that's something that hit me, particularly hard when we were taking this class, because I'd been exposed to some of Einstein's ideas before, but only in a very, sort of a casual way. And so, that's one of the things that I found very, very fascinating about it.
Cool. All right, well, I'll ask you to join me again in a few minutes, but I'll talk a little bit about the quantum dream and the legacy of Einstein's work. We know by looking at the spectra that that Niels Bohr was able to come up with a completely surprising picture of the atom. Against all the expectations of elementary physical theory, he said maybe there are electrons in orbits, what he called stationary states, and that these didn't decay, as you would expect any charged particle to radiate radio waves and then fall into the nucleus, but instead simply stayed in these orbits. The orbits themselves were invisible, but when an electron hopped from one to the other, the difference in energy would be radiated as a photon, according to one of Einstein's 1905 papers, namely that the energy would be equal to a constant times frequency, h nu. And that picture enabled Bohr to predict the spacing of the lines of emitted light from say, neon or another heated gas like hydrogen. This prediction of the Balmer series, the series of lines of hydrogen, was so radical so amazing that Einstein said, if this is true, it's one of the greatest discoveries in the history of physics. And Einstein and Bohr were off on a lifetime friendship and argument that never ended, where Bohr argued that this new picture of the atom, as it was adumbrated and elaborated on in 1925, 26, 27, and became quantum mechanics that's taught today, was a fundamental theory, that there was a way in which it had learned the lessons of Einstein and refused to speak about things that weren't observable. And Bohr said Einstein had taught us that simultaneity is not something absolute. It's something that we measure, and it turns out to be different for different frames of reference, that there isn't an absolute space. It answers to no observation that we could make. And Bohr said, so it is with orbits, or even the hopping between the orbits. It was only the difference between those orbits that emerged as photons of a given wavelength, of a given frequency, that could be measured. And so we could assign meaning to the idea of a hop between one orbit to another, but not to the path between one and the other, nor to what actually happens, whether that orbit is elliptical or circular. That we can't say. So this began a discussion, and Einstein and Bohr went back and forth, Einstein trying to invent new ways of showing that the uncertainty principle that Heisenberg and Bohr had articulated was somehow not fundamental, that you could get around it, that you could find a way to predict exact position and momentum or energy and time, whatever it was, and that the theory of quantum mechanics was incomplete because it couldn't give a representation of that which could be predicted. The gap between what could be predicted and what could be represented was, for Einstein, the sign of incompleteness. And Bohr argued time and time again that the theory was not incomplete, and that Einstein's thought experiments, like this funny little machine that Einstein invented one day in 1927, was not good enough to get around the fundamental limits to knowledge that were presented by the uncertainty principle. We then explored in the course a much deeper probe of these same ideas that said that Bohr was even more right than he had thought, that it was impossible to argue that you could retain the results of quantum mechanics and make exact predictions, which is what Einstein was hoping. That in fact, if you retain the results of quantum mechanics, you would never, ever, ever find a theory that gave a local realism, where you could take, for instance, two electrons that had been bound together at birth and then separated. You could never study the properties of one over on the right and deduce the properties of the left, because they never truly separated. As long as they were a quantum system, they were bound up in a kind of implicate order that could never be split apart. And when you split them apart, then they were no longer the same quantum system. And so Einstein's hope that you could keep it as a quantum system but somehow treat them as physically separable in which their variables were realistically interpreted was hopeless. And that Bell experiment, the reasoning about which began in 1964 and continues to the present time, has been a fundamental confirmation of this aspect of Bohr's work. And it makes the idea that Einstein had of somehow bypassing the apparent limits of quantum mechanics to get at an ultimately local, realistic description of the world was doomed to failure. Bohr and Einstein argued about this all their lives. Einstein came up with new experiments, and Bohr tried to shoot them down. And Einstein, in exasperation, said, well, don't you think that the moon is real, even when we're not looking? And Bohr said, maybe not. That there was something about quantum mechanics that told us that our classical ideas of causality, our classical ideas of a realism separate from observer, that these things were not to remain a fundamental part of physics now or for the foreseeable future. At the level of politics, Einstein's legacy was always to argue for equality, for whether it was racial, political, against genocide, against nuclear war. He was very involved, as we've discussed, with many aspects of this, attacked for his friendship with people like Robeson or Wallace. This picture was one of the pieces of evidence used in discussions against Einstein. But all of this was, for him, all the more reason to argue all the more strongly against testifying for the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was, although he had warned President Roosevelt in that famous letter that the Germans might be developing nuclear weapons, and so the United States should make every effort to understand and pursue this possibility. He devoted much of the rest of his life after 1945, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to campaigning against nuclear weapons, which he thought ultimately formed a devastating future annihilation of humanity. Einstein has been seen both as the instigator of the bomb and as fundamentally against the A-bomb. And here in a picture you have both aspects in one place. It says underneath, I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And yet Einstein is himself merged and morphed into a mushroom cloud. And that meant that after World War II, Einstein had another kind of fame. In addition to being, since 1919, the world's most famous scientist, the philosopher-scientist of the 20th century, the most important and most recognized person of the 20th century, he became, after World War II, through his equation E equals mc squared, the symbol of the nuclear age and its political implications, as well as the philosophical and physical aspects of a search for a unified field theory, the relativity theory, the idea of the solitary inventor, of someone who stood in for the possibility of somebody outside the mainstream in a patent office, say, transforming the nature of our understanding of the universe. One aspect of Einstein's dreams for the future of physics was to unify general relativity and electrodynamics, the two forces that he thought most important to grasp. That project never worked out as he expected it to, but the idea of a unified field theory, even some of the techniques that he developed, changed, embedded in other physical and mathematical theories, show up in the ambition of string theorists today. String theorists hope that you could imagine something fundamental in the world that's not like a miniature BB, not a particle, not an elementary particle with no properties other than its charge and its mass and spin and so on, but that you could have this structureless entity, was the goal of particle physics in its first and main incarnation. But the string theory idea was something else. It was that these tiny particles, many, many orders of magnitude smaller than anything that could be ever possibly observed, would form tiny strings, and that these strings had different vibratory states, like a string on Anne-Marie's violin, and when you pluck one of those strings, you get harmonics. You get multiples of the fundamental frequency, and that maybe these harmonics corresponded, these correspondents do, as they do on a violin string, correspond to different energies, and through the great equation E equals mc squared, they correspond to different masses. So maybe the tiny strings at different vibratory states actually present different masses, and this was the hope of string theory, all of the different particles could actually be reduced to a single kind of string in different vibratory motion. And as people tried to pursue this idea, turns out, to have a self-consistent mathematical theory, you need many dimensions, but then we have the oddity that we live in 4 dimensions, space-time, and that where are those other dimensions? Well, it's postulated maybe those extra dimensions are rolled up as if you had a piece of paper and you rolled it up very tightly, and then you looked at it from a distance, it would look like a single thin wire. Well, maybe there's a kind of rolling up of these extra dimensions, and that at each point in space and time there is a space called a Calabi-Yau space. Yau is one of our colleague mathematicians here in this building on the 3rd floor, and that became the goal of string theory, was to take this higher dimensional space, certain of the dimensions would roll up for reasons that nobody exactly understands, and then be able to present a theory that would not only have general relativity, that is to say gravity involved, but all of particle physics as well, and present a truly unified theory. This is a kind of visualization of such a Calabi-Yau space. And there comes to be an interesting battle that I just want to tell you a little bit about, called that you might think of as the holograph wars, in which 2 groups of physicists have split, theoretical fundamental physicists. One are the people that came out of general relativity, who thought that black holes, which Einstein was never very at ease with, but black holes were, you compressed matter so tightly that nothing could escape from them, not even light, and that these black holes represented the ultimate destruction of anything that fell into them. No properties remained. In a somewhat dubious expression, John Wheeler had a theorem said, black holes have no hair. And that meant that there was nothing characteristic of a black hole other than its mass, and therefore its size, and whether it's spinning or not, and maybe whether it has electric charge. But there are very few things that characterize a black hole, and any 2 black holes with those properties in common were to be indistinguishable. So whether you threw in a laser flashlight, a BlackBerry, or a desk, or a computer, it didn't matter. All the information about those things were gone. No way to recover, even in principle, that information. And the other group of people who were grounded in quantum mechanics thought there was something particularly special about the information, and that somehow quantum mechanics always told us information was preserved. So the 2 foundation elements, both created by Einstein, quantum theory and relativity theory, seemed to be in contradiction. One of them said the information is destroyed forever. The other said the information is preserved. Which was right? And over the last few years, and Hawking has weighed in on this, he was in favor of total destruction of information. Lenny Susskind weighed in, he was in favor of preservation. Andy Strominger in the physics department was in favor of the preservation of the information. John Wheeler was against the preservation of the information. So it was a real split. And the idea that's emerged is called the holographic principle, is that somehow there's a connection between what goes on inside a volume, like a black hole, and what's on the surface, the event horizon. And so you could imagine a black hole with an apple falling into it past the point of no return, and that somehow the image of everything about that apple would be replicated on the surface of the black hole, maybe in a way that was so mixed up that it would be impossible for humans to ever decode it, but the information would be there. This mix of quantum theory and gravity in string theory is a very strange mixture. In general relativity, there's a nice smooth curvature of space-time caused, say, by the Earth in the vicinity of the Earth. A black hole is a bending of that space-time down into a singularity. It's something that is collapsed completely so that nothing can get out of that hole. Information is an idea that we're all familiar with today. When you send a message and it's 60 kilobytes, or a picture and it's 75 megabytes, or whatever, some big fat TIFF file, then you're used to information being quantified. But that's a relatively recent phenomenon by Shannon and others. And the question was, what happens to that information? How does information get handled? And as I said, there's the quantum side, which says it ought to be preserved, and the relativity side, which seems to think it was destroyed. Information, of course, destruction and blocking is part of our political and historical culture. We know about censorship in the Post. We know about the trucks you'll see pull up at Harvard. I've seen them many times in the last few weeks, that are run by the National Association for Information Destruction. I didn't make that up. And they have branches, and there are all sorts of different standards for destroying information. But the destruction of information that the black hole advocates thought happened was much worse than anything that the National Association for Information Destruction could visit. And so I've invented, sort of for the purposes of this work with Kentridge, an imaginary society for the destruction of information based on this, and taken up certain themes that you see when there's standards of destroying information, then they will be projecting pieces of this in the piece. These are real excerpts from Information Destroyers. Material should be sliced into bits of 1 by 5 millimeters. You should shred, slice, hammer, pierce, tear, and burn the information. You can even see companies that shred secure. There are companies that destroy disks and hard drives like this. Oops, I have a little video that goes with that.
Machine.
This is what happens to secure hard drives in their displays. So the question arose, if you threw an encyclopedia into a black hole, would it be destroyed like that, or would it be destroyed in some fundamental way? And Hawking said, destroyed completely, irrecoverable even in principle. And Susskind, for instance, or Strominger said, no, the information is somehow preserved on the event horizon, on the surface of the black hole. And that became the debate. Wheeler said, every black hole brings an end to time and space and the laws of physics, as surely as the Big Crunch will bring an end to the universe as a whole. So black holes, like this one, black holes are at the center of the galaxy. Black holes, there's tiny black holes, huge black holes, but that these represent, for Wheeler, the end of all information about what went in, and for Susskind and Strominger and others, it represented nothing like that. It represented by this kind of holographic principle of a projection onto the surface, an image, however faint. Hawking and Wheeler said information must be destroyed, or do the laws of information preserving quantum physics refuse to end? In quantum physics, string theory, therefore, say information always remains. And one of the great developments of the last years has been a theorem, or a theory called ADS-CFT, anti-de Sitter space and conformal field theory, that says that basically all the space of string theory is replicated equivalently in the four-dimensional world that we live in. And now people are doing these really interesting experiments where they are looking at colliding big fat nuclei together, and in that soup of quarks and gluons, they can show that that four-dimensional physics of particles is actually exactly equivalent to what goes on in a black hole. The viscosity of the soup of quarks and gluons is identical to studying aspects of the black hole. And so you can amazingly study black holes by smashing particles together, something that's really quite completely unexpected. But in this equivalence between what goes on the surface of a black hole and the interior, and the debates over the holographic principle, and the exploration of string theory, many string theorists have come to the view that space and time are like a fluid. We only think a fluid is fundamental because we don't have good enough microscopes. If we could see more closely, we would see that they're just atoms and molecules. And so some of the leading string theorists have begun to think that space and time are like that they're really not fundamental concepts at all. They're just macroscopic things. They're kind of an effective theory, like a liquid is. Space and time, these are quotes from some of the leaders of the field. Space and time may be doomed. I am almost certain space and time are illusions. Space-time, we're going to have to give it up. But so in a way, you could see one of Einstein's great legacies in creating these two pillars of quantum physics and relativity has been to lead to string theory, the search for unification. But also the tensions between these two theories are still trying to work out how they relate to each other. I've said before in this course that every time relativity and quantum mechanics have come into collision, it's led to major advances. It led to major advances as Einstein offered his heuristic of the photon. It led to Feynman's great, and Schwinger and Tominaga, Dyson's work in 1947-48 in the creation of quantum field theory. It led to string theory, and it's led to this idea about this holographic principle. The tension between these two fundamental pillars were set up within a couple of months of each other by Einstein in 1905. Next, I'm going to talk about Einstein, God, and the cosmic order, but first, version 2 of our musical interlude and response.
This is our musical response to what you just said.
I concur.
So in a way, with the first piece that you did, there was I had a sense of loss, or of regret or death, or the transformation out in some way into some other region. But here, there's something quite different going on, and both in intensity and in sort of the potential explosiveness of the situation, and I mean, how do you see how do you feel as you move through the piece?
Well, that was like, most of that was improvisational, in case you guys couldn't tell. It was mainly sort of just a response to this idea of destruction of information, and it was like, started off in a very organized way, and then it kind of fell apart into I was just imagining that was me falling into the black hole, and that we were falling in together, and things just kind of fell apart, and I imagined it as this idea of being stretched out into like a very thin sort of fabric and sort of torn apart, and then information being lost. Like I tend to agree with the idea that I think information can be lost for whatever reason. That's just like one of the things that's so fascinating about these ideas is that you enter into this realm of uncertain philosophy, and there's a lot of speculation. So yeah, it felt like that information got lost there at the end.
Good. Does anybody have a question for Mike or Anne-Marie or me about this last section? Okay, on to the final third. So Einstein has two views of God. There are two features that preoccupy him in his writings about and remarks about God over the course of his life. One is that there is no personal God who intercedes in a daily way. There's no vengeful God that's keeping track of our individual actions. There's no God who resembles us in our emotional or affective life more generally. And two, that there is a God that represents a kind of what he called a cosmic order, a rational structure to the universe that we are in fact blessed with the capability of grasping, even if that grasp is only piecewise, fragmentary, and small compared to the whole of what might be understood. So I'll start with the question of a personal God. Einstein wrote to Edgar Meyer in 2 January 1915, "Why do you write me?" So this is in the middle of the destruction of World War I. "Why do you write me God should punish the English? I have no close connection to either one or the other. I see only with deep regret that God punishes so many of his children for their numerous stupidities, for which he himself can be held responsible. In my opinion, only his non-existence could excuse him." 1923. "I can look at doctrinaire traditions only with a historical and psychological perspective. I have no other connection with them." So he's not in favor of any particular doctrine, not from traditional Judaism, not from any other religion. "I cannot conceive," he says in 1927, writing to a banker, "I cannot conceive of a personal God who would directly influence the actions of individuals. My religiosity consists of a humble admiration of the infinitely superior spirit that reveals itself in the little that we can comprehend of the knowable world. That deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power, which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe, forms my idea of God." Or in a telegram in 1929 in response to a question, he said, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists, but not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and actions of human beings." "I cannot conceive of a God who rewards and punishes his creatures, or has a will of the kind that we experience in ourselves. Neither can I, nor would I want to conceive of an individual who survives his physical death, let feeble souls from fear or absurd egoism cherish such thoughts." So he's he's both hardline and very sympathetic. He considers himself a believer, but he refuses to accede to anything that resembles us in his concept of God. In 1934, in The Religious Spirit of Science, Mein Weltbild, My Worldview, you will hardly find one among the profounder sort of scientific minds without a religious feeling of his own. And this is a very important part of his conviction. But it is different from the religiosity of the naive man. For the latter, that's supposed to say, God is a being from whose care one hopes to benefit and whose punishment one fears, a sublimation of a feeling similar to that of a child for its father. And that, for him, for Einstein, is intolerable. Nothing in our human relations tells us about what God might be like. What God might be like is what he characterizes in his picture of a cosmic order. And understanding not just the negative part of Einstein's view, but the positive part, why he thinks belief in a cosmic order is actually a prerequisite to doing science or good science, is what I want to address in this next component. Einstein, in Conversation in 1920, said, "In every true searcher of nature, there is a kind of religious reverence, for he finds it impossible to imagine that he is the first to have thought out the exceedingly delicate threads that connect his perceptions." So this he takes to be fundamental. He believes that there is an order to be discovered, and over in different ways, and I'll show you many examples, he's saying that to us. He's saying that how could you devote your life to trying to unpack the laws of nature if you really didn't have some kind of conviction that there were laws of nature to be found? If there was no order to the world, if there were no laws that were self-consistent, if they were laws that didn't cover most of the universe, if the world was truly uncharacterizable, why would you become a scientist? Why would you devote the entirety of your time on Earth trying to uncover something that you didn't believe existed? I want to know how God created this world. I am not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are details. Einstein never devoted himself to the kind of model building that characterized a lot of physics then and now. He was interested in the principles. That's what he means by God's thoughts. What are the basic rules under which the world is to be understood? What are what I call the meta laws? What are the rules of the game? What are the rules of the road on which any scientific vehicle must pass? So relativity says all future laws of physics will have to be invariant with respect to change of perspective of the observer. That's the kind of thing he wants to know. What's equivalent to what? The equivalence principle, which says that the gravitational field is nothing other than an accelerated frame of reference. That, for him, is worth knowing. That's a constraining feature on any law of physics that's going to be put into place. My comprehension of God comes from the deeply felt conviction of a superior intelligence that reveals itself in the knowable world. In common terms, one can describe it as pantheistic. Spinoza. Pantheistic in the sense that God involved in all of the aspects of the physical universe, not abstracted entirely from it. Einstein, in conversation with the Indian mystic, poet, and musician Rabindranath Tagore in 14 July 1930, "I cannot prove scientifically that truth must be conceived as a truth that is valid independent of humanity, but I firmly believe it. If there is a reality independent of man, there is also a truth relative to this reality. The problem begins with whether truth is independent of our consciousness. For instance, if nobody is in this house, that table remains where it is." And here you can begin to see a coming together of Einstein's different thoughts. This is in the period when he's formulating his arguments against Bohr. This is between the Solvay meetings of 1927 and the formulation of the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox of 1932. His idea that there is an outside world, independent of our consciousness, our experiments, our interventions, and that we can grasp it, is part of his foundational views about God, about the cosmic order, about quantum physics, about general relativity. It's a unity of the unities of Einstein's thought that we're seeing here. On cosmic religion, 1931. It is very difficult to elucidate this cosmic religious feeling to anyone who is entirely without it. The religious geniuses of all ages have been distinguished by this kind of religious feeling, which knows no dogma and no God conceived in man's image, so that there can be no church whose central teachings are based on it. In my view, it is the most important function of art and science to awaken this feeling and keep it alive in those who are receptive to it. So here's a joint task for art, for science, and for a kind of sustained religious inquiry, all of them after an appreciation of an order in the world that goes deeper than our weak human grasp can ever manage. I see a pattern, says Einstein, but my imagination cannot picture the maker of that pattern. I see a clock, but I cannot envision the clockmaker. The human mind is unable to conceive of the four dimensions. So how can it conceive of a God before whom 1,000 years and 1,000 dimensions are as one? So there's a modesty here, a modesty about what's graspable by us, and a rejection of the idea that we can simply project who we are now in our feelings, in our relationship to our parents, or children, or each other, onto what the deity is, and instead to try to say this deity, which stands for cosmic order, is something so far from what we can grasp. We can't grasp four dimensions, but clearly there's no limit to what God in God's cosmic order might be able to understand. 1930, same period, again, between Solvay and the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen. The man who is thoroughly convinced of the universal operation of the law of causation cannot for a moment entertain the idea of a being who interferes in the course of events. And Einstein didn't anymore want to abandon the law of causation to quantum physics than he did to a God that interceded and, in Einstein's parodic view of it, threw lightning bolts down and stopped something from happening. He has no use for the religion of fear. That is to say, that person who is convinced of the universal operation of causation, has no use for the religion of fear and equally little use for social or moral religion. A God who rewards and punishes is inconceivable to him for the simple reason that a man's actions are determined by necessity, external and internal, so that in God's eyes he cannot be responsible any more than an inanimate object is responsible for the motions it undergoes. Even ethically, a man's ethical behavior should be based effectively on sympathy, education, and social relationships. No religious basis is necessary. Man would indeed be in a poor way if he had to be restrained by fear of punishment and hope of reward after death. Ethics should be something in order, this is very Kantian really, that humans must take that order to ourselves, be autonomous in that literal sense of a self-giver of law. Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man. In this way, the pursuit of science leads to a religious feeling of a special sort, which is quite different from the religiosity of someone more naive. To an anti-Nazi diplomat, 1941, German diplomat, in view of such harmony in the cosmos, which I, with my limited human mind, am able to recognize, there are yet people who say there is no God. But what makes me really angry is that they quote me for support of such views, because he considers himself absolutely to believe in God. I have found no better expression, Einstein said to one of his best friends, Solovine, late in his life, than religious for confidence in the rational nature of reality insofar it is accessible to human reason. Whenever this feeling is absent, science degenerates into uninspired criticism. If you don't believe that there's an underlying order with foundational principles, then physics becomes one damn thing after another. This is really at the end of his life. I have never imputed to nature a purpose or a goal or anything that could be understood as anthropomorphic. What I see in nature is a magnificent structure that we can comprehend only very imperfectly, and that must fill a thinking person with a feeling of great humility. This is a genuinely religious feeling that has nothing to do with mysticism. So what did Einstein want? To unify in science granularity and continuity, as we saw with the great papers that led up to Brownian motion and many other works, the photon. And to unify space and time, energy and mass, as we saw with E equals mc squared and special relativity. To unify gravitational and inertial mass with the equivalence principle. To unify gravity and electromagnetism with his search for a unified theory. To unify people, minorities and majorities, with a respect and recognition that would be truly universal and not based on race or creed. To unify nations around universal law, which he advocated very strongly and increasingly already in the pre-World War II period, but increasingly in the post-World War II period. To unify humankind around an idea of cosmic religion. Einstein once said that we should make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. And that, in a way, summarizes, it seems to me, much of what we've talked about in this course. An effort to recognize that we want to simplify, to unify the world, but to understand where the limits of our knowledge are. And that sometimes we're not in a position to be able to unify, as Einstein wasn't in 1905 with the heuristic notion that light was really like a particle. He did not know how to unify that with the wave theory of light. That would take another 50 years, interpreting it generously. And really, more strictly, it's a project in which we're still trying to find answers in string theory. So make things as simple as possible, but recognize the limits of that simplification. Let me turn for our final musical intervention to Anne-Marie and Mike.
We're going to have a couple of our other friends join us for this last little piece. I don't know if did you catch what we quoted there in the middle?
Yes.
That was Einstein on the Beach by Philip Glass. So gave a
You're all
little nod.
experts on that. So
Cool,
I also
cool.
hear bits from the piece that you did for Nuclear Underground.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, the pieces that you saw from the film, Mike is doing the music for that, so you may recognize some of those pieces. Do you have thoughts on the cosmic order and?
Let me know when you figure it out. That's all I gotta say.
Stand by for more on the cosmic order. But for now, thank you all for coming to Science of the Physical Universe 7.